Good. Ready.
Okay, and you go live on the webinar. Start webinar. The webinar is now live. Let's just wait for people to join us, please. I'm going to mute myself. There 42 participants, 47 participants. Can you see the participants
Yes.
down in the bottom?
Yes.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to start shortly, just waiting for people to log into the webinar.
We are at 90 participants at my side.
Everyone, we're going to start shortly, just waiting for people to log into the webinar.
Thank you, Prof. We can see your chat.
Okay, colleagues, maybe it's time to start. We have 93 participants. Good morning to the members of the Agriculture Economics Association of South Africa. My name is Johan Kirsten. I will be facilitating the webinar. It's the first webinar of our association taking place in the vacuum created by COVID-19, and with our conference not being able to participate. So the management committee thought it would be a good idea to use the month of October to implement a number of webinars to share ideas and relevant issues with the membership. So we have a panel of 3 members that will be talking to the issue of the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, and its relevant regulations on the agricultural sector. What we will do this morning is we will unpack the impact of the regulations on the various subsectors of the agricultural sector. And because there's been lots of different arguments about how the sector has been impacted, because it's quite tricky to measure the impact of the sector, especially at the primary level, given that agriculture was exempted from most of the regulations because it was classified as an essential service. And therefore, one needs to apply your mind very carefully on understanding the impact. So the idea is to unpack the differential impact and then go further into understanding how the relief program was designed and rolled out. And if we have time at the end, we will probably talk to the recovery plan that is now in discussion as well, which I think is probably good to highlight a few pointers to that, because I think some of the panelists are also involved in the process. So let me then ask the panelists to introduce themselves to you. First up, Wandile Sihlobo.
Thanks, Prof, and good morning to the members and all the participants. My name is Wandile Sihlobo. I work for the Agriculture Business Chamber of South Africa, that is AGBIZ. I'm joining the session today from our offices in Pretoria.
Thank you, Wandile. Sifiso.
Thanks, Prof. Good morning to everyone who is in attendance, and good morning to my fellow panelists. My name is Fiso Ntombela is my surname. I work for the National Agricultural Marketing Council, which is the agency for the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. I'm joining you from the very calm and sunny days of Midrand in Johannesburg.
Good, thank you, Sifiso. And Tracy?
Morning, Prof. Morning to everybody attending the webinar. I'm Tracy Davids. I'm a researcher at the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy, responsible for our Commodity Markets and Foresight program, and then also a researcher at the University of Pretoria, Department of Agricultural Economics. I'm also joining from sunny Pretoria.
Thank you. And obviously I'm joining from a rainy Stellenbosch. I'm currently in a position in the Management Committee of Agriculture Economic Association of South Africa as the editor of Agricon. So most of you will probably saw my name in various communications with the membership and with authors. So let us start the whole webinar by again emphasizing the point that we want to unpack the impact of the pandemic and its regulations on the sector. And again, I think it's very important for us as panelists and membership that work in the sector to reflect on our experience and our engagement with people in the sector about how the regulations have impacted on agriculture. Now, Tracy would probably mention to us later that according to their projections at BFAP, the agricultural sector is going to show GDP growth of roughly 13% this year. So, and as we saw the numbers coming out of the Q2 GDP numbers, we could see that agriculture was the only sector that showed positive growth over the last quarter. So with that in mind, one needs to be very careful how we unpack the pandemic's impact on the sector. So I think that is the way that we want to deal with it. So on the support to the panel, we have Marlene Labuschagne, one of the members of the ManCom that would facilitate us at the background. So Marlene, if you could share the screen of the table that sort of help us to understand the impact. It gives you a nice way of sort of framing the discussion with the various periods of lockdown in the first 3 periods of lockdown, which I think was the most severe, to help us understand that. So in the first part of the table, you see that all the field crops and the grains are listed. So Wandile, if you would like to talk to the grains and maybe indicate to membership whether the table is correct in saying that there's been no impact of the virus on the grain sector.
Yeah, thanks, Prof. I think the table is correct because by the time we get the pandemic and we go into a lockdown, that is somewhere towards the end of March. And at that time, I mean, we are already in season, crop maturing, heading on towards a harvesting. So there was not a lot of a distraction or disturbance that actually happened within the grain sector. So I think the assessment that everyone in the webinar is seeing on that grain section from maize to sorghum to oats, that's really the correct judgment. And I think for some on the winter crops like wheat and oats and canola, I mean, the plantings only started around the end of April or so in the Western Cape and the other areas. So I think overall, the assessments in various stages that is on there. But Prof, I think one thing perhaps that one would have to add is that, yes, things looked well, but there was a lot of work that went in to ensure that things will remain looking that way. And part of those was obviously the work that was done by both the industry, the government, NAMC, and institutions like BFAP, who were really tracking and seeing week in, week out, day in, day out about what were some of the challenges that various stakeholders in the grain industry were facing. And upon learning on those, then there was a good feedback from both the lawmakers as well as what was happening on the industry on making sure that any glitches are corrected. And I think that's what contributed to that, seeing it roughly looking good in that way. So overall, I think the grain sector did well. And obviously it was also at a time where commodity prices were good as we headed towards harvesting into June. So I think it's in part one of the sectors that has been driving the growth that you referred to, and Tracy will elaborate on later on the stage. So overall, I think the assessment that is there, Prof, is correct. And that's what we're also seeing it from our side. Thanks.
Thank you, Wandile. But wasn't there an issue about diesel supply that was caused by the pandemic that could have impacted the sector during, especially in the harvest months of May, June, July?
That, Prof, is part of those points what I was saying, that there was a lot of interaction amongst the industry players and also those that are in lawmakers to ensure that any of those glitches, because there was a diesel supply issue, and obviously there were pipeline distractions that had happened at that time. But I think those continuous interactions that were happening amongst various stakeholders is what assisted to ensure that those problems were resolved and then harvesting could begin. But the other point I would add, though, is that we were also lucky on the point of harvesting, because this season was actually a month delayed. Had it been normal, the harvesting would have had to start by end of May. So harvesting actually started to gain momentum at the end of June because of that late start of the season. So by virtue of that, I think that also was helpful in the process. But obviously, I mean, you were experiencing ports issues, you experienced interprovincial challenges of the movement of labor. But again, the quick responses between industry and lawmakers is what smoothened that. And I'm hoping that perhaps Sifiso might also elaborate that, because he was very instrumental also with Tracy on tracking on those day-to-day challenges that assisted on ensuring that we had that smooth transition that you're now seeing within that grain sector.
Good, thank you. Tracy, would you like to comment on Wandile's remarks on the grain sector?
Thanks, Prof. Yeah, I think very much in agreement with what Wandile said. I guess in some sense we were a bit lucky in the timing of the issue of when it struck, and that it wasn't at a time when there was too many operations happening. That's not to say there were no challenges. I think there were things that cropped up, as he said. You know, there was delays in the harbour. There was some, you know, getting parts for machinery and so on was a bit challenged. So there was delays on various aspects. And there was a time when I remember packing material was also a bit of an issue for the millers, and that had to do also with the demand for the different sizing, as your consumer was buying bigger packaging, going to the shops less frequently. But all in all, I would say very well managed. I think the extent of collaboration between public and private sector there. So it's not that there was no challenges, but I think the challenges were manageable. So one can probably say that the impact was minimal. I think the one that had maybe a little bit bigger impact was barley, obviously being tied to the beer sector and the fact that alcohol sales was not allowed. So your barley maltings that didn't carry on. So we built quite a lot of barley stock. Obviously the buyer, AB InBev, there is also tied into some procurement commitments. So I probably not zero impact, but selected impact. And I would say compared to other industries, probably less impact.
I was good that you mentioned barley, and it's an interesting dimension because the planting season for barley basically started in the first lockdown period, but then we will harvest now in the coming quarter, October, November. So there was an issue with storage space and the fact that there's a lot of stock of malting barley, and it could impact on the availability of storage and malting capacity. Is that something that you've picked up?
I think if one definitely in terms of storage, as I said, the stock levels were on the high side already before. So if we do produce this amount of barley, it may be a challenge. I think the malting capacity normally would be sufficient, but obviously if your malting plants now were not allowed to malt for a set amount of months, then in terms of annual capacity, that also reduces the amount that you can process. But I would think with things running smoother now, if we continue to phase out of lockdown, then we should be fine.
Good. Sifiso, any reaction on the grains from your side? You just unmute.
There we go. I should be unmuted now.
Yes.
I think on the grain side, really, they've covered much, both Wandile and Tracy. I think also the emphasis around the barley with the linkages of the liquor industry, which they really covered. I think the one that I wanted to speak to maybe on the horticultural sector, where
Yeah, we're coming to that. Let's just finish the grains. Is there anything you would like to flag that you think was not covered in the previous discussion?
no, I think I will be overgrazing on the grain side. They've covered it well.
Okay. Good.
Prof, maybe just one more point to make is just a price impact. So I think from things that we import, things like wheat and rice, obviously it's a bit more indirect because it comes from the exchange rate, but that exchange rate depreciation was also to a large extent associated with COVID. So I think, we saw quite a significant price impact on commodities such as wheat, which is important. And I think also not to underplay how important that big maize crop was in a year like this. I think, if we didn't have that big maize crop, if I'm thinking of the exchange rate and if we had to move to import parity, what maize prices would have been, I think we should also appreciate how good that was,
But
how
I
useful
think
it was.
generally one can argue that all the price effects that you refer now were positive. Is that not the case? I think even wheat farmers, maize farmers, all of them will have positive impact.
Positive for the producer, yes. Maybe not for the consumer.
Not for the consumer, though.
Yeah, obviously.
If I may just, Prof, a quick point in there. I think the one thing that, to the point about barley, the one point that will be useful, even to many people that are listening, particularly that are researchers, is really thinking about how to expand the export market side of South Africa for barley. Because right now, for example, on the backdrop of what Tracy and Sifiso were referring to about the potential slowdown in the domestic demand for barley on the back of alcohol issues, you also in a season where we are expecting the biggest barley in the history of the country and the biggest barley harvest, that's the numbers coming out of the CEC. Then if that is correct, we're going to have some bit of challenges, those folks that are operating on that space, which then makes the whole export perspective very important as we go forward. But that's something that is yet to materialize. But overall, I share all the sentiments that has been discussed.
And even now, after the maize harvest, were there any issues related to harbour and rail facilities and truck facilities of exporting the maize?
From my end, I mean, I don't know other colleagues picked anything, but I do think that, yes, there were glitches at the ports, but all of those continuously resolved. And there is ongoing work between Transnet and the industry on ensuring that there is improvements in efficiency. But I think if we can judge by the volumes that have been going out, I mean, there's been some good export movement out of South Africa, which is what has also been supportive of the pricing in addition to other factors like the exchange rate or so. So I think that on the exports of the grain commodities, it's been a good period. And even on importing the wheat and rice that is needed, the flow of those commodities also has been somewhat in a good pace.
Sifiso, anything that you picked up on the transport and harbour issues?
There were certainly some delays on the transport issues, but where there were some also the cases, of course, of positive testing of the employees in some of the harbour where they have to scale down to allow those employees to recover. So there were bit of some disruption, but minimum disruption, if I were to say so, in terms of the grain industries. One of the things which we also picked up in terms of the grains this season in particular, it was the really good crop coming up even from your smallholder farmers that came out into the number that you see on your supply demand estimate, which really brought up in terms of the crop part of it. So it assisted also with even your small mills that are sitting in the outscale part of the country where the issues of transportation could have been a major issue if you were relying mainly on the commercial side, and they were able to source from those localized smaller guys on it. So in overall, then the grain side was not very much impacted by all the COVID-related regulation. Even those interruptions that we said, which we're picking up from the food tracker, there were less concern coming up from the grain industries down the value chain part.
Okay, good. Thanks. So that's covered. So Sifiso, while you have the floor, let's move to, maybe you should do potatoes first because there's a restaurant issue here. maybe potatoes and tomatoes, and then we can do the fruits. So you've had a long section. Maybe we do the first page here, and then we take to the more controversial issue on the wines separately.
I thought you would keep the wines till the last, so that we
can do that.
But no, that's fine. Maybe before I even get into the potatoes, one of the key sectors that was during the hard lockdown, because of its perishability and also the aviation industry being almost at the standstill during the first few months of lockdown, even internationally, is floriculture, which we often don't really recognize, as well as the nurseries that move along that industry. So it's one of those that will move it towards the red with the wine. But in terms of the vegetables and the potatoes, we've seen a very strong impact during the early months of the lockdown, where the prices really was depressed. And as you said, Prof, on your opening remarks, that it was linked into the tourism industry and the whole hospitality industry basically being shut down, which affected the demand side of the tomatoes, potatoes, and other products that were affected in the vegetable sector. I think one of the biggest issue also that they had, which we noticed, was the interruption that happened into some of the national fresh produce markets, which couldn't operate at the maximum capacity, which then affected, as we know that potatoes is one of the very big product that is sold through the fresh produce market. And linked to that was really your informal traders, the transport, those hawkers that sell potatoes and tomatoes on the street, in the taxi rank, in the buses, which were then not allowed to operate during the first month of April, which then linked directly with that supply. Actually, the sale value chain of the potatoes or the tomatoes or other vegetables, including the onions, were very much impacted. And what that had impact on is that it affected the movement of those commodities in the fresh produce market, ultimately impacting your suppliers or your producers that produce that product. And later on, what we've seen with the potato industry and other vegetable industries is that they started having those concerns with as the country moved from the hard lockdown and easing of the regulations into lesser stages. They started seeing or raising a lot of concern around the potential influx of particularly of your processed product like potato chips that could be coming from other countries such as Europe and so forth, which will significantly put more pressure on the pricing of that product in the local market. So those were the main observation that we've seen in those commodities. And of course, you know, in that these are the very perishable products. So if they don't move faster, and also with the close of the borders where we can move them as quickly as we wanted to in the SACU markets or the side region, had that impact on the demand side of this product.
Okay, good. So that deals with those three: potatoes, tomatoes, and other vegetables. So in a way, you agree with the sort of broad assessment of that table?
Certainly, I will agree with the broader assessment of that table. Even the color coding part of it, that there was that impact. I see they also emphasize it mainly from the demand side and the price, which I will agree with that sentiment.
Okay, Wandile, any feedback from your side?
No, Prof. I mean, I generally share the sentiments that Sfiso painted out. Although I might point out now that since we've moved and the economy is relatively open and potato demand from the normal restaurant and other food entities is somewhat picking up, prices have somewhat recovered from where we were in June. So if we were to make this assessment from July and going forward, I think that cluster of the vegetable would have to be green this time around. But overall, I think that all of the aspects that for informal markets that he pointed out, because I think at the start of the lockdown, there might have been a bit of an oversight of the importance of that segment of the market. But I think the agility and also the ease of changing regulations as we picked up the challenges, that was very useful on making sure that we do adjust. And then lastly, I mean, on the point of the trade, I think, I mean, that's very important. We're starting to pick that up, see industry talking a bit about that, but there are institutions and instruments that are there to assist them in whatever issues they have there.
the issues on the informal trade was a big issue because that impacted on food access, the access to food for a large chunk of our population. But at the same time, it also had the supply chain impact through reduced demand and therefore impacted on the fresh produce markets. But Sophisha's point about the functioning of the fresh produce market was a big issue because they had in some cases, COVID cases there. Other cases, they couldn't have staff coming to the market. So that was really problematic. Tracy, any point you would like to raise on those three industries?
I think there's not too much more to say, Prof. I think it's been well covered. Obviously, the actual positive case in the I think it was in the Pretoria fresh produce market, the Tshwane market, that was an important aspect. But I think just in general, the fact that I guess we underestimated the role of that informal sector, and obviously that sector sources typically at the fresh produce market, and those markets are also big perishable products, then they're very sensitive to supply and demand issues. So then one does see a bigger price impact than what you might have for other products. But yeah, otherwise I think nothing more to add than what's been said.
Okay, just to reflect for members that you can post questions or comments in the Q&A facility on Zoom, and Tinashe Kapuya has already mentioned something there, that there was a SADC initiative to provide countries with a standard operating health protocol for cross-border movement of goods. These must be obviously led to delays at the borders, and we saw images of long queues and so on. Have you guys any knowledge of this, that whether the green zones and the protocols help the cross-border trade, especially in the fresh produce, Sophisha?
What often be the case is that you will have all these protocols and standards that tends to promote the trade facilitation cross borders into the countries. But the practicality of it, what you see on the ground, capacity always tends to be an issue. And in so abnormal times like we've seen during the lockdown, that issue of capacity, that issue of delays on the borders becomes even a more serious impact to the trade part of it. And the logistic, you spoke earlier on about the time where there was also delays around the access into diesel in some of the part of the country, which has impact in these things. So while it was the case that the borders were allowed to operate for the, particularly for transportation of goods, there were some reported cases where there were delays and where the product couldn't get into the tested market. But in overall, I would say I did not come across a very serious concern that interrupted any particular value chain along the vegetable subsector. Okay,
good. Let's move on to the fruits. Maybe we should take them in a chunk, Sophisha, because obviously deciduous fruit and table grapes were about completing the harvest when the first lockdown happened, and probably most of the exports have already taken place. So the general assessment is that there has been very little impact of the regulations and the pandemic on most of the fruits. So if we go to the next page as well, nuts, mangoes, avos, lychees, bananas. Do you have anything you would like to flag there that you think is out of kilter or out of line with your assessment?
Not necessarily. If you look broadly during that part of the lockdown or just the period before the lockdown, I see the dates there, or even on the June part where most of the regulation were eased up. I think it's important to mention that the fruit guys will probably be one of the guys that benefited the most, if I could say so. Because of the exchange rate issue that Tracy also mentioned earlier on. Because what happened with the summer fruit guys, like your table grapes, stone fruit, and the likes, the lockdown happened just when they were getting to the end of their harvesting and exporting season. And what that happened then is that devaluation of the exchange rate really supported them because they operate on the international market due to the foreign earnings part of it. Even the citrus guys, which were just getting into the harvesting and the exporting part of their activities, is that citrus was one of the products also that was very much in high demand during the hard lockdown across the world because of its characteristics and features that tends to assist with the flu-related viruses like the COVID. So there was that high demand actually for the lemons across
vitamin C.
Yes, So, but of course, the whole interruption, particularly in the Cape Town harbor, where there were a bit of some challenges there impacted from the supply side of it. But in overall, I think the impact of it, when you say that there was not impact on those commodities, whether you're also looking at your mangoes or the lychees, I would certainly agree with that part of it. The wine grapes.
Can I ask a question that Johan van Rooyen posted in the Q&A is, are you aware of any constraints in terms of exporting to the international markets on their side due to the pandemic? You know, people that have been worried about regulatory issues or staff issues at the harbors and receiving points in Europe or in the US?
What we saw with those guys, in certain market, like your specialized market, which are very much strict on your, where they have specialized protocols, like if you're looking at your South Korea or Japan, where they, even the certification and the movement of your SPS certificate need to be cured into those markets before the cargo enters to those markets. So there were a bit of challenges there where you could not get all those requirement documentation for the product to be cleared when it gets into the port on the other side, which led into some very encouraging discussion, or at least with the European markets, where they were able even to accept the electronic export certification from South Africa, which then allowed the export guys to happen. But other than that, I think there were not significant trade-related issues that they were faced by the exporters of South Africa to different markets. Even your special market, there were some measures that were put in place to assist, taking into account even the changing technology to ensure that you recognize some of even the pre-shipment inspection from South Africa.
Good. Wandile, you want to come in here?
Yeah, Prof, I just want to make a quick point to this question of Prof van Rooyen, because I mean, we also now have a benefit of the data, at least for the past, for the first half of the year. And if you look at the numbers, value terms, even if you adjust them for inflation or look at the dollar terms, I mean, our exports for this year are well solid compared to levels that we were in last year. So yes, there might have been the issues that Sfiso is noting, but overall on the volumes that ended up going out of various products, we've done well compared to, let's say, Q2 19. So I think from those bases, we would say that we've managed well.
Tracy, any remarks on the fruits?
Yeah, I think fruits is an interesting case. Maybe just a last point on Prof van Rooyen's question. I think maybe not so many regulatory challenges, but there were some delays also in terms of container shortages, taking longer to offload in the harbors. And they did definitely report shortages of shipping containers at some point. But I think, you know, maybe to speak to citrus in particular, because that's the biggest volume product in the market at that time. So it was obviously where the biggest risk lay. So there's been so much investment into that industry over the last few years, and it's really expanded. So we were expecting this record crop. And I think we've seen the influence of that. So we had a nice mix of events with strong demand for vitamin C, weak exchange rates, some challenges in some of our competitors in terms of exports. So there was a good market for the product, but I think given the volumes that had to move, it could have gone very wrong. And the fact that it didn't, I think it's a real success story in terms of how again, public-private cooperation, how they managed to sort the bottlenecks as they came up. There were delays. I mean, there were significant delays in Cape Town Harbour in particular. Fruit moved from Cape Town to go out through the Eastern Cape instead. So it was definitely not free of challenges, but I would say a real success story in terms of how challenges were managed to still get this huge volumes moved, and in the end have a record year for the product.
Okay. Wandile and Sfiso, maybe you should tackle the question by Robert Matsila. which says that it appears when we talk about grains, we only talk about the production side, and when we talk about veggies and fruits, we talk about the market side itself, and then we should probably unpack the impact on the production and the market and the consumer dimension. Would you like to react to that one, Lily, and then Sifiso?
Yeah, okay, Prof. Just to firstly, one point that I had wanted to just put across, Prof, in this conversation, before I come to Robert's question, is I don't know what other colleagues that are on the call are thinking about this, but one of the things that I was worried and interested on hearing people's views on is what will be the demand story look like going on into 2022 in most of the markets that we are exporting to. Because if we take Africa, for example, it's taking about 40% of our agricultural products. Given then the decline on economic conditions in certain geographies, do we think that the volumes of our high value products will still continue that way? Or what do we think is going to be the issue? Are there any adjustments that we do foresee or people are picking up in their research? Because certainly for us, that's something that we are interested on knowing on how it would affect things as we go forward. And to get to Robert's question now, I mean, I agree that we talked a lot about production on the grains, but also I don't think that there were many challenges on the market side. Tracy referred to some that were happening within the millers space. But given, if you look at the volumes that were able to go out of South Africa on an export perspective, and you also look at the volumes of maize processing from SAGES on a monthly basis, which tells you about how much is being milled within domestic market. And you will see that those figures are moving sideways of the domestic market production processing on a month-on-month basis. So that tells you that the activity there has been going fairly well. If there's any point that we didn't emphasize more is this issue of pricing. Because in a year where you have the second biggest grains harvest in the history of a country, you would expect prices to be at levels about 2,000 or even slightly less than that. But we're sitting now with north of 3,000, up plus 20% compared to last year. But all of those factors are in part the exchange rate Tracy spoke on, the global demand, and also that fast pace of South Africa's exports, both to the Far East as well as to the SADC region. So I think if you are producing grain, you're not really struggling to get the better return for your product out there at this point with these prices. Thanks.
Sifiso?
Prof, and I think it's a very interesting one as well. And I want to share the sentiment of Wandile in terms of projected demand shift or demand changes. But when you talk about the issues also on supply demand, one of the area which came out very strong, which I want to comment on, is the price setting, and really the gap between the producer prices and the retail price. And there was really around, I think it was around April or May, June, where in particular the guys in the vegetables, where the prices were that they were receiving, the producers, was probably at the floor level, while the retail prices was at the highest level. And there was even the whole issue where we've seen even some of the companies being reported into the DTI and the Competition Commission around the price gouging mechanism. And what we've seen also, Prof, with the research we do at the NMC, where it measures this price spread between the producers into the retail and the transmission of that price, which Wandile is also talking about in terms of the grains, of how do we, in good years, how do we find a way of transferring this benefit into the consumer side as well, so that they are able to get into the price adjustment? And I think that's one of the areas which we just need to look carefully as well, because while you understand there are a lot of marketing and distribution logistical costs between the producer and the retailer that retailers have to impose. But what we've seen during this COVID period was that big differences where the prices was just increasing at the retail level at the detriment of the producers who are not able to benefit some of it. And the growing gap across different commodities, whether you're looking at your vegetables, it's a similar thing we're looking even in our poultry, even to a certain standard at some of the lamb, where there's this constantly growing gap between your retail and the producer price, while the producer price continues to go down. And that because the issue where we're seeing that is that it has the impact also in terms of the farmers' ability to service and repay their farm debt that they tend to rely on during these difficult times.
Okay, good. Wandile, there's an interesting question for you from Denine Erasmus asking, given that we are now raising the issue of minimal impact through the sectors that we have done so far, why then the drop in employment in Q2?
Yeah. Oh no. And I mean, on an employment story, Prof, I think it had a lot to do with the regulations that were in place. Because firstly, a number of issues, if you look at the jobs data from Stats SA on the second quarter, the decline in employment were almost in all provinces, with the exception of Limpopo, Western Cape, and Mpumalanga. And that decline was in part because of the social distancing that had to be put in place. And then I think that if you look at the data in a granularity level, you might find that the people that were largely affected were perhaps those that would be brought in as seasonal labor. But I still think that the levels that agriculture is in and those slight decline on employment, I think it's about what, 160 something thousand people, it is way much better than what we are seeing on the other sectors of the economy. But overall, it has a lot to do with you needing less people in your farm, the restrictions on the movement of the people, interprovincials and stuff. So I think that's what really have been made. But the big question which we have to ask ourselves is, if I was a farmer and I was able to operate efficiently with less people in a year where I had record levels of a harvest, will then that employment number recover in the following years when we could get another good crop next year? Will employment recover to levels around above 800,000? Or will it remain at these levels and farmer be able to optimize the level of labor that they were actually able to work with within the second quarter of this year? So I think that those disturbances that actually happened in the labor market are one of the things that will be important. And I mean, to move us slightly away from Denin's point also, because I think this is also one of the important points, is the fact that in Europe, they were experiencing different challenges than us, the shortages of labor, as well as in the US. And those guys are starting to invest heavily on some of the technologies, which will be labor displacing. And now the question is to say, when those diffuse into South Africa, where we still see agriculture as an area for employment, I think that in the long run, we will have to think about these things differently onto that. Thanks, Prof.
Thank you. And that on top of that, we still don't believe the QLFS numbers. You know, that's the other reality. They sometimes
those numbers are credible, Prof. Statistics South Africa.
Oh, yes. Of course, you're on the council. Yeah, Wandile. Okay, Sifiso, the last in the horticulture thing that probably I can take a first stab is the wine industry. We all know that the wine industry was hammered. Probably not so much the guys that harvested already by March, April, because they've been largely completed. The farmers are just producing grapes for the cellars and so on. But those wineries, the wine estates, those are the ones that probably impacted dramatically. And then obviously the big wine producing companies that had basically 3, 4, 5 months lost in sales, which you will never recover. Some companies talk about 3 to 4 billion that is missing. And people can only drink so much in the next couple of months, so you will never recover those dimensions. So if you would like to respond to that reflection, and then I think Tracy, since she's running the wine model, she can also add to the sort of impact this will have in the future months and years on the sector.
My take on the wine industry, and also the point we discussed earlier with the vegetables as well, is that if there is one lesson that we need to learn from these two industries, is the importance of developing the local market, and how local market is actually critical for these export-oriented industries. And I think you're right. The wine industry, particularly the grapes, because there's about 55% of the wine it's consumed in the domestic market. Yeah. But I think one of the biggest impact on the wine, yes, it is the ban that was instituted on the sale of the wine. But wine industry, if you're looking at that agrotourism or the wine tourism, whether you're looking even the linkages with the hospitality part of it, I think that's where it really hit the wine industry strongly, where the issues of farm visit and tasting was not allowed. So the manner in which also the wine industry really find ways of developing the local market, increases the consumption of the wine, to ensure that it takes more share from the beer industry, particularly the three biggest consuming provinces in the country of the wine, which is your Gauteng, Free State, surprisingly coming third after the Western Cape, is really key going forward. So, and the whole issue of ensuring that how do you even come up with the alternative product and such over and above the one that you can generate from the wine grapes part of it. Because certainly during the lockdown, it was one of the industries that was badly hit. As you said, the numbers that that they lost, and that some of it cannot recoup because it's the service and the opportunity lost that they can never come up with. But the big guys which will have the storage facilities and the capabilities and to store that wine, they can still recoup that, as we've seen when the easing were elevated, they were able to sell some. We've heard some of the stories, particularly those big guys that even have the muscle to market the product and even export it to the international market. But those are the very few isolated cases where they even were able even to sell above your normal sale that would have achieved in the previous year. But in overall, I agree, and I think I'm in line with the assessment in terms of both the wine grapes and the wine cellars, that they were badly hit, particularly in the first part where even export were not allowed.
Yeah. Good, Tracy, give us some reflection when you ran the model in terms of the fact that there's lots of wine in storage now and the oversupply globally and locally that will now impact on the industry.
Yeah, so I mean, wine as an industry, we can probably spend the whole time talking about. As you've said, one of the worst, if not the worst, hit by the lockdown regulations. But I think there's also, there's so much to consider here. So firstly, they couldn't export for a month, which knocks your revenue, but it also knocks your reputation. You lose shelf space overseas. So it's a much longer term impact than just the 4 or 5 weeks that you couldn't move the product out. So that's one aspect of it. Obviously, our market split about 50-50 exports and domestic sales. On the domestic side, again, you have the fact that we couldn't trade. We had the second ban, so it was a long period of sales not being allowed. But on top of that, there's also the lasting economics of it. So now you can buy again, but it's, wine is one of your more luxury agricultural products. It's not so. The fact that spending power is so weak, the fact that spending power is likely to be weak for the foreseeable future, we're looking at an extended recovery. All of that also influences on the demand for wine products. So that's another aspect of it to consider. And I think if you put all of that together, you add the wine tourism aspect that Sifiso was talking about, you add the hospitality sector, which was also closed for a long time. There's just many different aspects that knocks the demand side. The industry has actually gone through quite a long period of trying to reduce stocks and had done very well. So it was poised for a good year before the lockdown and COVID and all these things struck it. So it's been, if you look at the stock levels now, it's gone right back to where we were 5-6 years ago, if not higher. And as I said, that the time taken to the weak demand side means that it takes you longer to get those stocks worked out of the market. So that implies that your price impact isn't only current, because obviously because of the weak demand right now we have low prices, but because we carry these stock levels and it takes us multiple years to work them out again, the prices also remain depressed for multiple years. So it's very much an extended impact there, not just a single year and quick recovery.
Yeah, and what will be the impact on wine prices in the coming months and next season? Tracy?
Sorry, Prof, I just had a bad connection. Can you just repeat?
Just the impact on wine prices in the coming months and years.
Yeah, so there's different scenarios to look at there. I mean, a sharp decline, how sharp, I guess, is debatable. Much of that depends on how much storage capacity we actually have, which seems a little bit uncertain. So if we can store more, then your immediate impact is not so big. But if you can't store as, if you can't store as much, you have a bigger impact now, but less of an impact in years to come. So it's a bit of a trade-off in that extent, but yeah, significant year-on-year decline.
Okay, Sifiso and Wandile, is a political question for the two of you that Van Rooyen is asking is, don't you think the reason why the department's relief program didn't come out all barrels firing and assisting the wine industry is because wine, like tobacco, is considered very bad and not something that you should be supporting? What was were there any of those type of discussions going on within your committees that you were party to?
Don't comment on politics. I'm joking. Prof, just a quick thing, and I will link this comment with the question that comes from Prof. Van Rooyen. The first thing that I wanted to mention is just to slightly add on what Tracy was talking about. Because if you look at the numbers that are coming up at from Vinpro, they're suggesting that the 2020 crop was actually up roughly by 8% or so on volumes term. So to that storage issue that Tracy is picking about, I think that might be a challenge even going into the future, particularly if even this season is actually going to be good. And again, to Denin's question of employment, I think that for Q3, that's where we will actually see the effects of all of these challenges within the employment side, particularly from the Western Cape on the back of the cash flow that was really bad for the guys. And I still think that it remains a challenge for the wine industry. So you can expect the employment numbers from there to be bad. And I think nationwide, they will reflect badly because Western Cape takes about 20% of agricultural jobs. Now, on the point that Prof. Van Rooyen is speaking about on a political side, I don't know. I don't think that might have been, perhaps I think it might have been a default in a sense that South Africa, when they think about agriculture, generally people think about agriculture and think about it from a food security perspective. Maybe then the support system was structured in that way, people were having to say, let's look at what can really put food on the table directly, but not really thinking about the indirect benefits of supporting such industries through employment and everything else. But I don't know if there was a political stuff onto it. I doubt so. I don't know.
When I looked at Sifiso's face, I think he knows, so he must talk to us. You must unmute for Sifiso.
Prof, I think when the lockdown came on, I think the importance was certainly on the saving livelihoods. So remember also that when you're thinking of agriculture, because it was an insulated sector of regulation, and the table that we've been analyzing really attest to that somehow most of the industries were insulated to a certain extent. But I think in terms of thinking that really dominated the design of the relief at the time was around how do you ensure that you have food security, particularly for the vulnerable group. As you remember, Prof. and the colleagues, that even the president, when he first announced that the priority is to protect the most vulnerable so that you ensure you save as many livelihoods that you have. So by design, then there will be that focus on ensuring that even the household levels are able to produce the food that they will need. And to a certain extent, we did see as the lockdown progressed, that while we had sufficient food at the country level, there were some part of their society that couldn't access food or couldn't even afford food. And the relief fund was designed to also cater for those that are unable to afford food so that they can produce it themselves. But I wouldn't certainly go with the narrative that perhaps there was a political thinking behind of not supporting the other industries. I think all the industries, as it progressed, it became so apparent that they need to be supported, and the relief fund need to be expanded, because even the new data that has come along, which we couldn't have access of that data during the pre-lockdown, such as how impactful the wine industry will be because of other regulation that mainly come from the health side, as they're protecting the tobacco and the wine industry. So that would be my response to Prof. I don't think it is necessary was the politically motivated decision.
Good. We need to serve the cabinet good wines, and then they will change the attitude, maybe. Tracy, let's get to livestock. Obviously, the wool guys were worried at the first lockdown period, but maybe you can refine the arguments that were presented in the table there, and whether you agree with the assessment.
Yeah, so again, I think as with horticulture, the effects are quite diverse across various aspects of the livestock sector. Obviously, your fibers, your wool, your mohair, they were not classified as essential, so they couldn't operate originally. But then the product is also less perishable, so it has certainly cash flow implications. But if you think of something like wool, you know, maybe there's the payback exchange rate, and given how much we export, we can still realize very good prices once we get that product into the market. I think if you come to the meat side, and probably dairy as well, I think these are products that are quite sensitive to spending power. So if you think of, I think if you consider COVID impact, you think firstly the impact of the lockdown, but then secondly, as we were saying earlier, that extended impact through income. So meats obviously are sensitive to spending power. So I think the demand side was hit by firstly the weaker incomes, the rising unemployment, and then secondly the food service sector. So something like poultry, I mean, 20% of the product goes into the food service sector. So if you close that down, that's quite a significant immediate effect on your demand side. But I think a lot of the product was also, you know, the industries had to be flexible. They had to pivot. That product needed to move. So I guess one would argue that in South Africa, we were probably more flexible in getting products that might normally have been destined for restaurants into the supermarket, where demand was then again a little bit stronger. So I think there was a lot of aspects at play. In terms of price impact, again, differs by sector, depending on how the pricing works, depending if we're a net importer or more a local market. If I think of something like poultry, we didn't see a huge price impact, but we did import quite a lot less. So there's aspects to consider. If you look at beef, there was probably a bigger price impact. That market quite sensitive to domestic supply and demand. But again, I think the increasing reliance on exports, particularly of high value products, to balance and to optimize your carcass value, probably served the industry well. I think, you know, a lot of our exports goes to China now. That market opened up probably earlier than our own. So the fact that we could move some exported products out probably supported prices to some extent. Pork, similar, also quite sensitive on the demand side, but there we also imported quite a bit less, given weaker demand from the food service sector. So, yeah, I would say mixed aspects, but quite a significant impact on most of the meat industries.
And can you talk to the cash flow of farmers in the beef and dairy and meat industries? Poultry, you've maybe focus on the poultry as well.
Yeah, so I think obviously your prices, the lower prices will have an impact there. It's a bit difficult to evaluate that because it's, you know, you're talking about long production cycles, so it takes time to adapt. You can't just switch production on and off for many of these industries. So it's a longer cycle to reduce production and to increase it as well. But then at the same time, if you look at something like beef, the supply actually wasn't as strong as one might have expected. But if you know, a lot of your weaner calf producers would also have cash crops, for instance. They would also be doing maybe maize and soybeans. So if you have this mixed enterprise, the fact that the maize was doing well in some respects also allowed producers to maybe rebuild their herds more aggressively. If you think of where these industries come from, you know, the beef sector is in a rebuilding cycle. So if you have some cash flow from your field crop side, you can maybe retain a bit more than what you maybe were planning. So you rebuild more aggressively, and then you also mitigate the price impact on the market. I think from a poultry perspective, the cash flow implications were quite significant in that initial phase of lockdown, particularly when the fast foods couldn't operate and the takeaways and everything was closed. If you think of something like KFC, that's a huge outlet for the poultry industry. So with those not functioning, there was a big impact. But later, as that started to open up, those things also recovered. Of course, you have to look to the feed as well. You know, the fact that maize is more expensive than what one might ordinarily have expected in a year like this, that also influences the position of your intensive sectors, in particular, your feedlots, your poultry, your pork producers, all of which have a huge cost component attributed to feed.
Okay, thank you very much. We have about half an hour left of the webinar. Before we talk to the relief program, maybe we should deal with some of the questions that were posed in the Q&A section. Wandile, maybe you should tackle the first one from Moses, talking about the SAFEX import parity prices that move in tandem with the level of strictness exhibited during a specific level during the lockdown. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I think, Prof, there isn't much to add from what we have already alluded, because there's about 3 major factors that are driving commodity grains prices at this point. It's your weaker exchange rate. It's the growing demand for South African maize, particularly from the Far East, and also even in the region, the likes of Zimbabwe. If Moses look at the exports pace for this year compared to the previous years, we've been quite aggressive. We have already exported around about 55% or maybe 60% now. If you look at yesterday's numbers, I haven't looked at them for the recent week of all the volumes that we plan to export for the season. And obviously the third point on that, it has to do with a lot of the global factors. The global commodity prices are at really higher levels, and that has to do with China aggressively buying a lot of maize and a lot of soybeans and driving up the global grains prices really at relatively higher levels. And obviously there are weather issues that happened there in Asia and also to a certain extent in the US and parts of Eastern Europe. So a combination of factors, Moses, higher global prices, strong demand for South African products, and also the exchange rate is what is driving the commodity prices to the levels that you are seeing at the moment. Thanks.
Tracy, you want to comment on that question? Tracy, are you there?
Sorry, Prof. Comment on the parity price question?
Yes.
Yeah, I think Wandile has it fairly well covered. I think there's a lot of dynamics that one has to consider. You know, it's always difficult when you look back to say how much of what we saw was COVID and how much of it was also other factors. So if you look at world prices, you know, China buying more, how much of that has to do with them rebuilding their pig herd following the ASF outbreak? As Wandile said, there have been weather challenges in various parts of the world. So you have to look at world prices, you have to look at the exchange rate, which in itself has COVID-related and non-COVID-related aspects associated with it. But yeah, I think even domestically, if you discount the fact of where export and import parity prices are, then in things like the fact that we have had some challenges with quality of maize also influences prices, because it, you know, that supply and demand balance for the product that the millers want to buy gets influenced by that. So I think there's a lot of different factors, but I think Wandile covered most.
Okay, let's do one more question. The interesting one, Mazwanele asking about the impact on garlic, ginger, and lemons during the lockdown period, and also probably we can add pineapples. So, Sifiso, you're the market expert. You know, is there any trend that you observed? Obviously, we all know about the pineapple prices because people were making the pineapple beer, but did the ginger and the garlic also increase as people thought that could also help to cure the disease?
Yes, that's your typical consumer preferences on the pineapple and finding the substitute of wine. But I think in terms of ginger and garlic, those consumer perception of trying to say that they will assist them, like the vitamin C on citrus. So those were the commodities that I think we on a weekly basis don't end about it. The question to say how the prices are. At some point, I think even on the garlic, the Minister of Finance cooking styles also contributed into the increase demand for garlic. So there were definitely those spike in terms of outliers on demand and the prices that have fluctuated those specific products. we saw that.
Wandile, you want to comment on Tito's cooking recipes?
Now he's driving up garlic prices.
Okay, good. Colleagues, I think this is very nice. I don't think we've left out any industry if I look at the table. So we've covered all of that. So Marlene, maybe you can drop the table so that we can have the panel videos prominent. And maybe to start with, Sifiso, the issue that we now have is that given that we've unpacked the diversity or the diverse impact of the pandemic and its regulations on the industry, the question is, how did the conversations happen in the design committees on the relief program for agriculture? Because the first stance one could say that agriculture does not have to have a relief program because they were doing wonderful. You know, the grain guys were coining it and the citrus guys were making lots of money. So, and why do you then design a program that sort of do a blanket relief to all the sectors? So is that something that had to be done quickly and without having the luxury of analyzing as we've done today? Or was there anything else that was in the works to help design that process? Maybe you can start, Sifiso, and then I go to Wandile. Maybe Tracy can also react.
Yeah. So I think you're right, Paul, in terms of not having luxury of time as well as the data that we now have to recalibrate some of the parameters that were included in the initial design of it. And I think it's still an ongoing process because they are expanding those relief funds. But in terms of the need of the relief, certainly agriculture is one of those sectors that desperately do need, might not necessarily be coined as a relief fund itself, but the support that is needed, in particularly your vulnerable smallholder and the emerging farmers, or should I say, your household and your Black emerging farmers that are continuously struggling to survive in the value chain, in the competitive value chains of agriculture. So there wasn't it. What, as I said earlier, Prof, and to all the colleagues that are in attendance, what was the primal concern at the time, just at the beginning of the lockdown, was how do you ensure you provide support to the most vulnerable so that they can be able to cope with the impact that we could expect as the COVID unfolded, because we didn't know at the time how long it would last. We still don't know even now. So one of the available data at the time, which we could want based on it, was the assessment that was done even on the platform on how vulnerable they are and how critical they are to provide food for the most poorest part of the country, the part of that 25.2% of the population that is living under extreme poverty line of less than 800 rand a month. So hence the focus was to then say, which commodities in the short term crop related or crop commodities are also that are very key in terms of your typical food basket? Should you then prioritize and give support so that the farmers can be able to produce that product and be distributed into the households around? So those were the main factors that were taken into account in designing the early stages of the relief fund. But of course, as it progressed and with new data as it come out, there was a general agreement to say there's a need to then expand it, even look at other commodities which were worse affected by then the COVID-related regulation, like we spoke about the floriculture, we spoke about the wine and other products. So I think it's an evolving process that is also taking the new data and readjusting as it moves forward.
But help me to understand the sort of thinking. You know, we all agree about the vulnerable groups and small farmers that sell locally and so on, that they need assistance. But my question is, if you think about this tight fiscal situation, you want to spend your money in the best way and to have the biggest impact. The question is, how did the pandemic and the regulations impact on those vulnerable groups? In what sense? Was it because the local markets were closed, with the informal market were closed? But if you think about a maize farmer on 5 hectares in Limpopo or in Northwest, how would the the virus and the pandemic impact that community or that household?
So one of the very direct impact of the household, particularly in the vulnerable group that we're talking about, is it's an income loss. So these are the people who live from the hand to mouth on daily basis. Now, with the closure of the informal market, it simply means that person is taken out of any activities of income from day one of the COVID closure. So you then have to be able to say, how do you come up with food security related measures that will complement your social development relief that are providing those income to those that have lost it from the day one of the COVID crisis? So those are some of the direct impact that you will know. And then one of the ways to then say, how do you increase the capacity of that person so that he or she can then be able to produce his own food? Hence, you will have seen, Prof, that at the very beginning, one of the criteria was to say, let there be a minimum and a sort of a proof of income for those producers. But later on, that criteria has to be removed so that you expand the access to that kind of relief for even people who have interest and have land and can be able to produce the food that they need. And what we've seen also, some of the early data that is coming out is that more people were able to plant their own food, and some of them not necessarily using even the government fund, some of them using other means of income that they've had to enter into the agricultural space. And I think with the numbers that we have seen, also the change perception and the look of the agriculture as one of the sectors that can be able to accommodate more people into the formal value chain will change as we go forward.
Yeah, and probably the argument you make is that the group that was targeted fell outside the UIF, the TERS, the social grants, and so on. But if you probably start unpacking the income sources of many of the households in those communities, you will find that there would be at least one grant recipient or one person that will get a UIF or a TERS grant. So with the doubling of the grants, you could potentially have covered the income loss that you refer to. So my argument is that we're not sure whether the agricultural productive dimension is capturing that loss of revenue from the household perspective. So I was not sure about how the thinking was, because there could be now a household that is a small farmer with other sources of income as well, lost a job informally, but probably qualified under the UIF or was also a grant recipient, a child grant or old age grant.
And you're right also on that part in terms of at least one form of another that will be applicable into a typical household of it. But what's even interesting with the emerging data also on that thinking is that while all these schemes and the social grants were there, probably most of them were at a delayed, which did not even serve their intended purpose from the first beginning, if we were to go with that kind of income grant that goes into the household. But even the bigger schemes like your UIF, we've seen with a lot of delays, even with the missed payment and the whole other maladministration, which I think it's outside our discussion for today, which really talked about that. So while they are all important and they serve different purposes of it, I think as the data comes up, we'll be at a better position to assess and basically see what could have been done properly to ensure that you at least gain some efficiencies, even the different instruments that were available. But I do sustain the fact that even those that were created, it did have some positive spillover effect, at least in the minimum, to those that did lost their income part of it. And perhaps another is that the efficiency then of them being implemented on the ground, because we did, if you can then look on the negative side in terms of the system that was used to distribute even those that were successful to get them, there were some delayed, which then on its own doesn't serve the purpose that was intended in the first place.
Good. Wandile, action on your side?
Yeah, I think, Prof, we now have a benefit of hindsight of looking into this, which is where I sympathize sometimes with the lawmakers, because they have to make some of these decisions in real time as a number of information is evolving. But overall, now then looking back at it, I would agree that the impact, the sectors that faced a large part of the impact, as we have discussed, the wines and everyone, are at a much more worse position, perhaps because of the pandemic per se, relative to where the support as perhaps maybe went on to a certain extent. But we have to recognize the point that Sfiso was putting forward here, that there is also a developmental angle that was also within there, at least for my judgment, looking at the support. I'll say it was a support, but it also had a developmental angle on it, which is why it was categorized the way that it was categorized in. And obviously, I think what was pleasing for me was the fact that also the people who were benefiting were going to various agribusinesses, getting all of those inputs. Then the financial flow was through that mechanism. It's not like a guy was getting his own check. Thereafter, he might use the money for any other thing. The money was really going on into the agricultural activities. So I think that was obviously a positive. As to whether the scheme has been a success or a failure, I think we yet to see that, because people are getting inputs. Some are still getting now, some in the past few months. Then until we have a clear sense then of what was the production in all of those people that have gotten that input, that's where we will have a sense then that perhaps maybe on a developmental side, did this really get to have any positive spill-offs onto it? And I mean, I would, in closing, also agree with the points, because I've seen Mr. Nyoto, Bonan Nyoto at NMC, putting some submissions on the chat room, where he makes a point that in an income basis point that we're discussing, a number of poor households depends on remittances and stuff, which were on themselves then depleted by the COVID issues that affected on that. But I doubt, or I don't know if that was a thinking during the restructuring of the program that was in there. But he's right on putting on that point. But I think right now, again, to close on with the point that I started with, we're making a lot of assessment with the data that we are having. But at the time, I sympathize with the colleagues who were putting it in place, that maybe it was hard to see what would come up and how this pandemic would affect the overall sectors.
Okay, we've probably dealt with most of those questions. Just to confirm, Sifiso, the category of farmers that qualified were all small-scale farmers below 50,000 turnover, if I remember correctly. You're on mute.
Yes, it was 50,000, which was generally during those early discussions with the industry captains in those sessions, which was considered as a sort of a criteria that you can use to then be able to determine who is the real farmers or someone that will have been on the farming before that time.
Okay. Tracy, any comments you would like to make on the outcome of the relief program and the sort of design and rollout?
This is probably not too much I can add, Prof, to what's been said already. I think just, you have to recognize that funding is limited. So obviously there's a big prioritization aspect to that. So if you have limited funds for the program, how do you prioritize? Who do you spend it on? Again, it comes back to the point that Wandile make, was it just a COVID relief fund? Because if it was purely designed for COVID relief, then it should probably have been better targeted at specific subsectors that were more restricted than others. But then if it's a combination of COVID relief and development funds, then one can see that targeting it at your smaller producers also makes sense. But I think, yeah, there's a lot to be said. I think there's definitely small farmer in one industry is also much bigger than a small farmer in another industry. So I think there's industries where there were trade restrictions, where maybe your smaller producers in those industries, because they're higher value products and they, your turnover is much higher. So maybe those guys don't qualify for the funding, but they were actually in a really desperate position because the restrictions on their trade was more extensive. Within that industry, they are still smaller producers, so they are quite vulnerable. But maybe we're left out in this aspect. So, but I think it's easy in hindsight. And as Wandile said, we haven't seen the full impact. One will see how the effect that that funding had, I guess, in future. But it's easy to debate it now, not in the heat of the moment when the decisions are made.
Yeah, it's interesting, the document in which that table appears, myself and Wandile and Ferdi argued at the end that one should typically, if you apply a diverse approach, you would ask the farmer to submit a claim for losses against the COVID pandemic. So that philosophy is coming through now in the what do you call it, the land bank application. I think DAFFIS, Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, has now provided 100 million for the land bank to help farmers with land bank payments. So I got the application form, and it's very interesting to see how they deal with this, exactly how we've been discussing. They ask you, give you assessment of the losses, and also then show us how you define the price before COVID and during COVID. And then you need to provide bank statements. And in essence, what you do, you claim against or claim on the basis of your losses that you've that incurred as a result of the COVID. So the principle of a claim against the damage you had in the COVID period is well implemented in the land bank's case. So, which is very interesting that that scenario. So now when you do apply it yourself, you suddenly realize, but you're not sure where there was an impact. And do you really, are you able to verify that your loss in revenues just purely as a result of COVID, or is it as a result of the drought? So they are sort of an interesting way that these principles are now worked through to make sure that the reach of your funds that you're available is much wider and more dedicated to people that need to be saved from the damages of the pandemic. So that's an interesting thing. Sufficient?
Maybe just a quick one on that one, Prof, as well. That the very same one which you are now putting on, which has been rolled out on the land bank, was actually announced at the same time as the one for the smallholder farmers. But of course, the challenges of the land bank somehow delayed the implementation of that part of the claim.
Okay, Wandile, any reaction on the relief program?
No, I think, Prof, we've already traveled a great length at this point. I won't add any other point. Thanks.
So the president of LEFSA is asking a question. We need to react to that, otherwise we're in deep trouble. Do we have numbers to indicate whether the lockdown regulations benefited the producers more or consumers? There's always a trade-off, especially on those kinds of ad hoc policies. So do we know 6 months later whose welfare was enhanced or negatively affected by the regulation? That's probably a topic for a master's or a PhD thesis, Matlo. But Safisha, do you want to take a first step? And you can get another PhD for that answer if you're correct. Just
Prof, I think you have already given our president the answer that that answer will provide it in the next ISA conference. We will have enough data by then.
Okay, good. Wandile?
No, I would also, I think that it's best to answer such questions one-to-one as a benefit of numbers. I'm cautious of just assuming from the face value that I'm seeing, but I think it's something that requires to be looked at.
But Tracy, maybe you and the BFAP team have already done some tracker analysis that you can give us a first stab to this?
We don't have all the answers either, Prof. I think, yeah, I mean, maybe I don't answer everything that Matlo asked, but I think COVID has been very interesting or unique in the sense that it's almost influenced, it's influenced things differently at various parts of the value chain. So if you think of something like meat, for instance, in many instances, you actually saw producer prices going down, but retail prices going up. And then you ask yourself why, but then you have you've got the processing aspect in the middle, where you've got social distancing requirements, and as a result, you've reduced the capacity, for instance. So you've added additional costs in the value chain in terms of complying with COVID-related regulations. You've reduced the capacity of processing, so now you have a weaker demand for the primary product, but you also have a weaker supply into your retail where your consumer is demanding. So it's not, normally one would expect to see things flowing through the entire value chain in the same direction, but in the case of COVID and how it's impacted at various points of the value chain, that hasn't always been the case. So it's definitely affected both sides. I mean, which one was more heavily affected and less heavily affected? There's probably an answer that needs to be answered for every specific subsector, because that will be unique and different for every specific subsector.
Okay. I see Usapfa wants to ask a question, but you must type it in the Q&A, then we can read it out. But maybe, Sifiso, given your point about the assistance to small-scale farmers, maybe you should give us an answer to the question that O'Brien Perrell has posted there about how we're going to assist small-scale farmers post the pandemic, given that they are asset poor and that they are finding it difficult to have all the means and ends to really continue with production. Could you have a first stab at that, and maybe Wandile can also come in?
Prof, I think on that one, and thanks for that question, I wouldn't think it's only related into the pandemic itself. I think it's just a structural question which has been with the agricultural sector for the last 2 decades. That probably need a very active thinking from the broader membership of the IASA to say, how do we really deal with the issues and all these constraints that are facing the smallholder farmers? And we mainstream them into the formal value chain of agriculture and provide a comprehensive support that is effective and also free of all these other inefficiencies that are delaying it. And to the very core of this question for me, which I really don't have a direct answer to it, but my thinking, Prof, it really goes back into your own teachings back at the universities of institutional economics, of how do you really bring back institutional capacity of the institution that's supposed to provide assistance and deal with the issues that are facing smallholder farmers, ranging from your support, financial support, whether you're looking at the land bank, ranging to your markets, whether you're looking at the NAMC, provision of innovation and science and research, whether you're looking at the ARC, and linking that with these industry bodies that have mushroomed over the last 2 decades. And I think those institutions that are tasked to provide that services, it's safe to say they have not come forward for the smallholder farmer into the country over the last 2 decades.
Thank you, Sifiso. Wandile?
Yeah, I think Sifiso has spoken to that, Prof, to a large extent. But all I can add is that thinking that is just shared now should largely be part of the recovery process, because now we're at a stage where we're thinking about how to recover from the pandemic. But obviously, agriculture is not really necessarily all recovering, because it's been doing relatively well, some subsectors. But it's about how do we now grow inclusively as we go forward. And I think the important constituents that Sifiso perhaps maybe I didn't mention is also the farmer organizations that smallholder farmers, some are affiliated to say, how do you bring about to have really a united voice of driving development amongst the farmer organization as well as this institution that is mentioning. I'm mentioning that again to your work, Prof. The political economy on agriculture, we're not speaking a lot about it, but I think it's a major thing that actually stops development and progress in some of this. So I think there's gonna have to be some bit of work on the political economy of agriculture, and obviously state capacity, and making sure that there is a bit of execution for various programs that will be designed, but all of that should be part of the post-COVID strategy.
Yeah, thank you. And post-COVID is probably going to also have an impact if you think what is happening in the UK and the EU. Tracy, do you want to respond to Denine's question on whether the new lockdown rules in the UK and the EU is going to have an impact on our wine, grape, and deciduous fruit industry?
Prof, I think if you look at the extent of trade through the lockdown, through the hard lockdown that we had, I would say it's probably not the biggest expected effect. You know, with something like this, the demand for fresh fruit, vegetables, things that are healthy is always strong, especially in these developed countries where they have a bit more budget to support the consumer, etc. Things seem to work fairly well through this lockdown, so you would expect that it can do so again. I think 1 or 2 concerns have been raised on things like air freight. You know, some of these products actually fly out in the early season. Obviously, with international flights not going, that's more expensive. It's less available. So again, small challenges, but I would say broadly not challenges that can't be managed. I think if we managed to get our citrus crop out successfully through the hard lockdown, we should manage okay with this.
Yeah. And if you think of the other dilemma that nobody has raised, is the international tourism that has been a big driver of our hospitality industry, and therefore the demand for most of the agricultural products, and especially the wine sector. Sifiso talked earlier about the local demand, but a lot of the local demand and local sales take place at the wine estates, where the tourists come and visit and spend some time and taste and so on. So this is going to be a very difficult period. Johan van Rooyen also asked a question about the new normal. The new normal, I'm not sure is going to be normal, given that we are going to have constraints on tourism, which is a big driver of many of our products. And also the fact that your transport system, as Tracy has just mentioned, is under constraint. You will probably find it difficult to trade all your top-end products that needs air freight and so on. So there's going to be a challenge for the food system as we proceed into the post-lockdown phase. Colleagues, we've come to an end. It was an hour and a half of thorough, interesting discussion. It almost worked better than a conference because we don't have to worry about the audience too much. We can discuss and interact. And the audience were very active, the members of the association. There's even people that are trying to sell chicken, you know. So those of you that have a market for chicken, you can actually email Takanyane and ask him to sell his 40,000 birds over the internet. So Sifiso, that's a challenge for you at the NAMC. Provide the guy with the market, please. You're always good at that. So I think we should close. I want to thank the panelists for your participation. It was really fun. It was really great. It was not a boring paper presentation as we normally have at the conference. It was nice, interactive, and people with good knowledge of the industry that could talk to the issues, and we could debate and reflect on the challenges that we have as agriculture economists in participating in policy making. Sifiso, now you see we have to apply all our political economy, institutional economics, and plain economics and marketing to help the decision makers deal with difficult circumstances and in quick turnaround time. So thank you to the membership. Thank you to Marlene Petrie for hosting the webinar. And also I need to thank Masego in her absence. I'm not sure whether she's logged on, to facilitate and help us to get the Zoom package for the association organized so that we can have proper webinars, that we can share screens, and that we can, as a panelist, a group of panelists, talk to the issues very effectively. So thank you very much to everyone. Have a good day and a good weekend. And we look forward to the next webinar. Melissa and Marlene will probably announce that soon, but at least take note of the AGM that will take place on Friday, the 30th of October. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Prof, for facilitating. Thanks, Marlene.
Bye.
Organizing. Bye.
Thanks, Prof. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Okay.